Hello, and welcome to the 5th episode of the Knitting House podcast. I'm Claudia, this is Minerva, and she's desperately neglected. She never gets any fuss, never gets any attention. She's the loneliest cat in the world. And that's why she's going to hang out with us today, probably. I mean, she can do what she wants, but I think she's quite happy here. It's the first week of May, and you can tell because I'm wearing a cardigan. I mean, you can't actually see the cardigan because it's covered by a cat. But I'm wearing my Felix cardigan. All links to patterns that I mention are in the description box. But I'm also drinking an iced tea, so, you know. Minerva, can you not claw any holes in my cardigan? Lovely. I really appreciate that. Today we're talking about cats. That's not true. Today we're talking about knitting. I've got... oh god, I've got one finished object I want to talk about that I really cleverly left upstairs in the bedroom. So I'm gonna have to get that at some point. But obviously I can't get up while the cat's on me. So let's see if she stays. If she stays, then we'll have to start with the whips. I'm afraid there's no other option. Alright, we'll start with the whips. So, trying to balance around the cat. The whip that I have been working on the most, and one that if you have seen previous episodes of this podcast, you're already sick and tired of seeing and hearing, is the Helia jumper by Joanna Ang, I think. I've not done this for a month, so I've already forgotten what everything's called. The reason I've not done this for a month is because I've just not had much new stuff to talk about. But now I do, because I've made some real progress with the Helia jumper. As you can tell, I have finished the body. And all that's left to do are the sleeves. I say all that's left to do like that's not the trickiest and most complex part of this jumper. If you haven't been following this podcast, then let me just recap. This is a top-down raglan jumper that starts with a... oh, off she goes. That starts with a double-folded neckband in twisted rib. And then, pretty much right away, you move into this very beautiful cable pattern on the sleeves. Raglan increases are also done in twisted rib. And then the front and back are simple stockinette. So there's a lot going on from the start because you are essentially going round and you've got sections of stockinette, you've got sections of twisted rib, and you have sections of cables. I really hope you can see the cable detailing in this shot. Then you separate for the body, and the body itself is knitted in plain stockinette with a little section under the arms of twisted rib. So you can hear that's the side, and then on the other side you've got exactly the same. So that just gives a nice little bit of interest, and it also makes the knitting of the stockinette body more fun, because firstly, it visually separates the round into two halves, and secondly, every now and again you just got a little bit of twisted ribbon to knit. You know, just so you don't forget how it goes, because there's plenty more of that to knit when you get to the bottom, to the ribbing, to the hem, which is also twisted rib. At this point, I can knit twisted rib in my sleep with my eyes closed and two cats on me. When I started this jumper, the twisted rib was kind of slow and laborious, but by the time you get to this ribbing at the bottom, you really are just doing it without looking, and it becomes very natural and very fast. So, the body is done. If I'm not too lazy, I'll insert some footage of me actually wearing this. So now all I have to do is pick up for the sleeves and knit what is ostensibly the most interesting but also the most labour intensive part of this jumper, and that is the very long and complex cable chart with lots of different cable stitches. Cables range from 2-stitch cables all the way to 5, I think. Don't think there's any 6-stitch cables, but either way, big complicated cables where you purl and do other horrible nasty things. That's, you know, I already went through the chart 1.5 times by the time that this split. So I've already done all of the chart. I know I can do it. And I'm sure I made some mistakes in the top part, but honestly, I don't think you can tell. The yarn, I've talked about this a few times as well. So I'm going to make this short. It's 2 yarns held together. One of them is the Drops Brushed Alpaca Silk, of which I have 3.5 of these donuts left. And then the yarn that I'm holding this double with is my trusty old street yarn. It's kind of become a running gag. I feel like I brag about this yarn in every single podcast episode. I found this on the street. It's probably sheep's wool. It's quite old, I think, because it doesn't smell sheepy. Maybe there's some silk in it, but I doubt it. I mean, why would you throw this out in the first place? It's really nice yarn. If you want to know more about this, I believe in episode 2, I set this yarn on fire to try and find out what it was, and you can watch that excitement in a previous podcast episode. So holding these 2 yarns together, I get what I think is a really nice texture with a really nice marling effect. I like the strong marling. I know lots of people prefer to hold 2 very similar yarns together when they do work double-stranded, but I like the depth that gives the yarn, the fabric, and I also like that it darkens off the quite intense teal colour a little bit, because I'm not one for colour, as you might be able to tell. Even my cat is monochrome. The second whip that I don't want to spend too much time on because I've made no progress on this one since the last episode is the Summer Secret Crop by Jessie Maed Designs. Very popular pattern. I don't really feel like I have to say too much about it. It's a free pattern and it's very adaptable, and it's written in a way where you feel confident that you can make your own changes. One such change for me, I'm pretty sure, was actually the needle size. Because I made a swatch on the recommended needles, which were 4.5 millimeters, and then ended up sizing down to 4 millimeters just because I liked the fabric of those a bit more. Actually, I don't want to tell you any nonsense here, so let me just check if these actually truly are 4 millimeter needles. Ah, there it is. My little, what do you call this? Sizey thingy. So I think these are 4 millimeter needles. Yes, they are. So I'm knitting this on 4 millimeter needles instead of 4.5 millimeter needles, but still using a yarn that is, I believe, technically a fingering. What is it? Or is it a DK weight? It's 265 meters by 100 on. God, I can't language today. And the yarn itself is a yarn I nicked from my mum. I don't know where she got it. I'm guessing it's quite a cheap yarn because that's what she tends to go for. And it is 70% cotton and 30% polyester. The fabric that comes out is quite nice. It's quite drapey, even though I've sized down on the needle size. And it's also opaque. I did not want a see-through top. And the opaqueness, that's not a word, the opacity is probably partly because it's this black and white plied yarn mix. So yeah, the reason I haven't done any more work on this from the last podcast is because I really want to finish the Helia jumper before it gets too warm to wear it. Right now, bit of a weird day. It's a pleasant 21 degrees outside, but the ground floor of my house where I'm sitting right now is usually quite a bit colder than that, which is lovely in the summer. Just so pleasant to come in from the heat of summer and sit in the cold. And that means that right now I could still be wearing that Helia jumper if I finish it in time before the summer gets properly going. However, now that I've done the body on the Helia jumper, I expect I'll be picking this up again as my TV knit, because those sleeves on the Helia jumper, there's no way I'll be able to actually focus on the chart while I'm watching something on TV. Right, now I may as well go and get those socks I wanted to show you, my finished object for this episode. I recently travelled to the UK, and that meant spending a lot of time on trains and coaches and on the plane. And I have so far not been brave enough to try and get a pair of knitting needles onto a plane, because in the worst case, they take them away from me, and then I don't have any knitting to do after the plane either. So I wanted something that I could knit on the way to the airport and on the way back from the airport, and also while I was visiting my in-laws. And I ended up taking a 40-gram ball of leftover sock yarn and a pair of 2.25mm knitting needles, and I made these shorty socks. So, as you can see, they're not entirely finished. You might also say, that's not a long enough yarn tail to leave. Well, it wasn't when I cut it off, but earlier my cat decided to nibble at it, which she likes to do when she's protesting about not being fed. She gets fed twice a day, regularly, and she still thinks that she has a valid case for protest. So anyway, I'm going to have to see how I'm going to weave in this little bit. It's also a reason that I'm careful not to leave any knitting lying around. However, these ones, I forgot that I'd left them on the windowsill upstairs, and the cat got to them and ate them. Anyway, that's not what I want to talk about. So, they're very boring vanilla socks. Reason being, I made these on the train. I did not want anything complicated, did not want to have to look at charts or think in any way. And the other reason was also that I had 40 grams of yarn, so worst case, it wasn't going to be enough. And that's exactly what happened. I made sock number 1, and I know some people eyeball the length of socks, but I actually use a row counter app on my phone. It's called Bee Counter. It's fairly standard, it's free, it's not particularly complex, but it does the job. And so I counted up my little rows on Bee Counter and made the sock to the length that I required. The construction is very simple. It's a 1x1 rib, it's a heel flap and gusset construction, and then just a standard wedge toe. Came out alright. Then I started a second sock, and I could tell pretty soon that I did not have enough yarn. I mean, obviously I didn't. I was trying to make a pair of socks from 40 grams of sock yarn. Of course that wasn't going to work out. I do have tiny feet. I wear a shoe size 37.5 in European and 4.5 in UK. And I still haven't looked up what the actual US size is, but you know, there's converters online, you can figure it out by yourself. You know, I was very optimistic. Delusional, some would say. I tried to make it the same length, didn't work out. Ended up having to unravel when I was most of the way through the wedge and making the actual foot shorter. So now, this sock has about, I think, 7 or 8 fewer rounds on the foot than this one does. So really what I should be doing is taking the longer sock and shortening it as well. However, is it actually longer? If I hold the two socks together from the back of the heel, and I just let them hang down like that. See, they're starting up here at the same point at the top. I'm holding them down. Can you tell which one's longer? Because I can't. They are, in fact, the same length. Even though one of them has like 8 more rows than the other. Here, another comparison. So how the hell did that happen? The answer is pretty obvious. My tension is all over the place. Just to reiterate, I made most of this on the train over the course of a week, and I made some of this while sitting at my in-laws and watching TV. So the longer sock, the one that's got more rows, has a much tighter tension than the shorter sock. And I really don't know if you can tell here. This is the one with more rows and this is the one with fewer rows. But it is actually visible how much firmer and tighter the fabric is for these as it is for these. So, long story short, what I'm going to do with this is wash them, block them, and then see if there are still differences. I'm not going to weave in the ends until I've done that. If the long sock, the one with more rows, grows enough in blocking that it's noticeably different from the short sock, then I will unravel that and shorten it accordingly. But I'm hoping that's not going to happen. Let me know what you do in this case. Also, are you one of these people who counts rounds for socks, or do you just eyeball it? Because I absolutely always count the rounds, except of course when I'm doing 2 socks at a time, which is less of a faff in terms of the actual knitting, but I decided against taking that on the train because it is more bulky and more fussy because you're dealing with either 2 balls of yarn or you're using 1 ball of yarn from each end. Either way, not something I wanted to mess with on the train. And also, what are your experiences with knitting on flights? Do let me know if you've ever had a pair of knitting needles confiscated at security. This is what the Beak Count app looks like. As you can see, it's pretty simple. You can just make row counters and then plus and minus them. It also has a little section for notes, which I do use for a lot of things. One final thing I wanted to talk about in this episode before I finish is 2 items that I didn't knit or crochet, but that have been knitted and crocheted for me. Well, for me and my husband. He lives here as well. Although I think he doesn't appreciate home knitted and home crocheted items as much as I do. He'd probably agree. And those 2 items I want to show you are blankets. One of them was knitted by my mother-in-law, and one of them was crocheted by my mother. So let me show you these. The first blanket is this beautiful red and blue, huge, enormous blanket that my mother-in-law Carolyn made. And she made this for my husband and I when we lived in Wales before we moved back to Germany. She used those colours because red is my favourite colour and blue is my husband Bill's favourite colour. And we both really liked how that looked. We used it on the sofa, living room sofa in our house in Wales. And it's been in storage for 2.5 years. Like, we moved here pretty much only with 2 suitcases and 2 cats. So a lot of the stuff that we had in Wales was left behind. But my in-laws came to visit us recently and they brought those things over, including this gorgeous knitted blanket. As you can tell, they're really quite simple. They're just garter stitch mitered squares, but they are knit at such a tight gauge that makes them really thick and squashy because of the garter stitch. Beautifully warm and made from like a million different yarn scraps. I really like this blanket, and now that it is in our house, it's used in the sofa, in what we... Can you hear that? Is that a cat? Minerva? There's something scratching at the house. It's a beetle. What are you scratching at? You're trying to scare off other cats outside. Yes, very good. Keep going. In this new house that we live in, in this ancient house that we live in, We have 2 small rooms that we use as the living rooms, and because they are 2 rooms, and we briefly considered knocking through the wall between them, but this is such an old house that would be a massive risk to do that. You never know if it's gonna stay upright or not. So instead we've just split our living room into 2 spaces, one that we call the TV room and one that we call our sitting room, because we are fancy. The TV room is furnished with new furniture, mostly IKEA, and is kept in very dark colours because, you know, we go in there to watch TV. And the sofa is a navy blue sofa from IKEA, and the blue and red blanket fits there really nicely. And because the downstairs is nice and chilly, we use it as well on there. The other blanket I wanted to show you is a crochet blanket, and I know, it's probably blasphemy to show crochet stuff in a knitting podcast, but you'll just have to deal with it because I really love this one as well. And this was made by my mum. She can technically knit, but she doesn't knit. She doesn't like it. She is much more into her crochet, and she made this. Now, I'm not that knowledgeable about crochet terminology, as if I'm knowledgeable about knitting terminology. Anyway, I think this is called a granny stripe? Is it a granny stripe? Or is it just an enormous granny square? Actually, it's just an enormous granny square, isn't it? So yeah, this is a square blanket that she also made from lots of different random scrap yarns, and it's very colourful. And this one's used in the other living room space, which we call the sitting room, because we are fancy like that. The sitting room does not have a TV in it. It's got a record player, because we are the worst hipsters. The furniture here is for the majority secondhand, and so the old-fashioned look of the granny square, I'm just going to call it that, fits in here really nicely. I have been using that blanket extensively while I've sat in the corner and knitted, because this sitting room contains my knitting corner. It's just an armchair in the corner with a lamp next to it, and is also by the window. This is a very dark space. The windows here are tiny, so there's not much light that's coming in to this room. You might not believe me, because this looks perfectly well lit. There's one studio light there, the lamp behind me, and the lamp hanging overhead. So I'm blasting myself with light here. It's a very dark room otherwise. And so this adorable crocheted granny blanket is just a nice little pop of colour. I think it's incredible that 2 women have decided to make blankets for Bill and me, because if you've ever made a blanket, and I have once, you know how much work goes into it. You know how much actual labour it is to take a pair of knitting needles or a crochet hook and some yarn and make this enormous thing that's huge and takes up so much space and takes up so much yarn. So I'm very, very grateful for both of these items, and I cherish them, and I can't imagine ever wanting to replace them with a blanket that I made, because there is something special about having something that has been knit for you or crocheted for you. Now, my mum is retired. She has been crocheting like a machine, and as well as making this blanket for me, which she made after Bill and I moved here, because we didn't have a blanket because we had to leave the other one behind in Wales. She's also been making a lot of blankets for my cats, which is just adorable. She is not, no, that's wrong. She was never a cat person or an animal person, but since she's had to make peace with the fact that she'll never have human grandchildren, she has, I think, started to take to the cats. So much so that when we talk on the phone, her first question is, "Have you eaten?" Because she's an Italian mother, and for some reason, that's just something they always say on the phone. If you have an Italian mother and you talk to her, she's going to say, "Oh, hi, have you eaten?" Yes, what have you eaten? So the second question that she asks on the phone now is, "Have the cats eaten?" Yes, what have they eaten? Wet food, as they always do. Anyway, this rounds off this little blanket roundup. Bit random, not the sort of thing I've seen on knitting podcasts, but I wish there was something we talk about more, because gift knits are such a special thing. And we often talk about gift knits from the gift knitter's perspective because that's what we are. And I'm sure I'm going to have an episode where I talk about that as well. But there is, like I said, something super special about getting something handmade as a gift. And I feel very lucky to have that. If you do as well, then you'll understand just how lovely it is to have something that's been made for you by someone where you, because you do the same craft, you know exactly how much work went into it. It just makes it all the more special. So that was it for this episode. I expect I'll see you in about a month's time, unless I suddenly become super productive and I get everything done. We'll see. You never know. If you want to see more of this though, this is episode 5, which means there are 4 other podcast episodes to catch up on. And I've also made another video that's not a podcast episode about my knitting plans for spring and summer. Thank you for watching. Bye.